The sun was setting over Washington, D.C., casting long shadows on the marble buildings and painting the sky in fire orange and soft purple. Inside a quiet room, tucked away from the noise of politics and power, Joe Biden sat alone. The air was still. Surrounding him were photographs, some black and white, some faded moments frozen in time handshakes, speeches, wars avoided, wars entered. The weight of history was everywhere. Months had passed since he'd left the presidency. But the echoes hadn't left him. They lingered in every corner. Some days, he welcomed the silence. Other days, like this one, it felt crushing. That afternoon, something unusual tugged at his thoughts. A single, strange urgency kept returning. He needed to write a letter, but not to a senator, not to an ally, not even to a known world leader. His mind kept circling back to a young man thousands of miles away, a president not many Americans could point to on a map. Ibrahim Traoré. Half a world away. In the heart of West Africa, the streets of Ouagadougou buzzed with life. Motorbikes weaved between street vendors, and the rising sun cast golden light across red dirt roads. Inside a modest office with no luxury, no grandeur, President Ibrahim Traoré was already deep in thought. Maps covered the walls. Folders stacked with handwritten notes filled the desk. His coffee was cold. The young leader, barely into his 30s, wasn't thinking about diplomacy or public appearances. He was thinking about food shortages, about security, about children growing up too fast under pressure. No child should bear. Traoré was a leader, born not of pedigree, but of necessity. Back in Washington, Biden stood by the window, gripping a pen. What if he misunderstands? A voice inside him whispered. What if this looks desperate, or worse, patronizing? But something stronger overpowered the doubt, a belief that leadership, at its best, meant reaching beyond comfort zones. And so he wrote. A few days later, a sealed envelope bearing the insignia of the United States arrived in Burkina Faso. When Traoré saw it, he paused. His aides exchanged glances. It was rare enough to hear from Washington, but a personal letter from Joe Biden, unthinkable. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he held it in his hands, feeling the weight, not of the paper, but of the moment. The U.S. had always felt like a distant force, powerful, often uninterested, occasionally involved, but never personal, never like this. What did Biden want across the globe? The question echoed in closed-door meetings and newsroom debates. Why would an aging American president write to a young African leader in a country wrestling with its own storms? What was this genuine dialogue or veiled strategy? Nobody knew. Not yet. But two men, one watching the world in his rearview mirror, the other staring straight into a storm, were now connected by something as simple and as powerful as a letter and the world. It had just begun to pay attention. The envelope sat quietly on Ibrahim Traoré's desk, its seal unbroken, its meaning still unclear. Yet, the room around it crackled with tension. His top advisors leaned in, eyes darting from the paper to one another, trying to read a message that hadn't yet been read. Sir, it's from the United States. Yacouba Dio, Traoré's most trusted aide, said carefully. It carries the presidential seal. Silence. Traoré didn't move. His hands rested on the arms of his chair. but his mind was racing. This wasn't a memo. This wasn't a policy draft. This was personal. And the signature on that seal carried the weight of a world that had rarely knocked on Burkina Faso's door without strings attached. "Why now?" he finally said. No one answered. Meanwhile, in a private residence, far from the West African heat, Joe Biden paced across the hardwood floors of his study. The letter had been sent. There was no turning back, and though his reasons had been sincere, he couldn't stop second-guessing himself. "Maybe I should have called," he muttered. "No," said Ann Carter, his former Secretary of State, who'd flown in for a visit. "Calling would have felt like an order. A letter is an invitation." Still, Biden couldn't shake the feeling that something could go wrong. That words, even the right ones, could be twisted, misread, misunderstood. After all, how many years had he spent in politics, learning that perception was often louder than truth, and in Ouagadougou, perception was already taking shape. By noon, the envelope's arrival had leaked to a journalist from Le Monde Afrique. Within hours, the story had spread. President Biden sends personal letter to Burkina Faso's Ibrahim Traoré. Speculation erupted like wildfire. Was this a diplomatic reset? A hidden warning? An olive branch? The media in both countries took notice. In Washington, analysts filled evening news panels. Some praised Biden's gesture as bold and long overdue. Others called it reckless, warning that the U.S. might be seen as desperate to regain influence in Africa. In Burkina Faso, reactions were even sharper. Citizens flooded radio stations and online forums with opinions. "Finally, the world is paying attention to us," one caller said. "He's trying to pull Traoré into something," warned another. Inside the presidential office, Traoré still hadn't opened the letter. He stood now, hands behind his back, facing a window that overlooked the dusty Capitol. "This isn't just about me," he said quietly. "This letter, it's going to be read by the world, even if it's only addressed to one man." Yakuba nodded. "And the world will judge not just the letter, but your silence or your response." Traoré exhaled slowly. Back in the U.S., Biden sat alone again. The envelope he'd sent had become something larger than he'd imagined, larger than either of them. All he'd wanted was to offer a hand, not start a storm. But that's the thing about history. You don't always know you're making it. And as the cameras kept flashing and headlines kept spinning, two men remained motionless on different continents, in different time zones, both wondering the same thing. What happens next? The envelope was finally opened. Inside was a single sheet of presidential stationery, neat, simple, yet impossibly heavy. Traoré unfolded the letter slowly, like a man unwrapping a loaded truth. His eyes scanned the words, then scanned them again. He didn't speak. Around the table, his senior advisors waited, breath held, pencils stilled. A room that usually buzzed with urgency, now frozen by what they saw in their leader's expression. Not anger, not joy, but something harder to define. A tightrope of emotion. On that page, Joe Biden had written words that would soon echo around the world. He began not with demands, not with declarations, but with acknowledgement. "I see your courage." Biden wrote, "I see a leader standing firm in a storm." He praised Traoré's resolve. his willingness to lead amid chaos, his refusal to back down. And then he pivoted. Biden wrote of global challenges, of a shared burden, of how nations, no matter how far apart, needed each other in an age of uncertainty. He offered partnership, dialogue, mutual understanding. But buried between those lines was something else. Something subtle. A test. Because while the letter celebrated Traoré's leadership, it also implied a quiet suggestion that cooperation with the West was not only welcome but necessary. And Traoré felt it. It was not a threat. Not a command. But it danced on the edge of expectation. He placed the letter on the table. Silence stretched. Finally, Yakuba Dio cleared his throat. "It's gracious," he said, choosing his words carefully, but also strategic. Traoré no dedunse. He speaks to us like we've just arrived at the table, as if we haven't been building it from the dirt. Back in the U.S., Biden sat in a quiet garden behind his home. The letter's final draft, still playing in his mind, like a song you can't quite forget. Ann Carter sat beside him, watching birds dart between trees. "Do you think he'll understand the spirit of it?" Biden asked. Anna hesitated. "I think he'll understand everything, Joe, including the parts you didn't say out loud." That night, the media frenzy reached fever pitch. On television and online, analysts dissected every known phrase from the leaked draft shared responsibility, collaborative leadership, global stewardship. Some called it a rebirth of American diplomacy. Others dismissed it as a soft power stunt. In Burkina Faso, the reactions were more visceral. At a downtown cafe in Ouagadougou, a university student named Amadou read the translated letter on his phone. "He calls us brave," he said, "but he also calls us to follow." An older man next to him shook his head. "He's a politician. Every word is a hook. Watch where you bite." But in the presidential palace, the debate was no longer about the letter itself. It was about what came next. Traoré leaned forward. "Finger steeple. The world is watching now. Not just them. Us too. You know what this is." Yakuba said quietly. "It's not a message. It's a mirror." Outside, the wind picked up. Somewhere between two continents. One leader waited, and the other had just realized he was standing not at a crossroads, but on a stage. The curtain had lifted, and the spotlight was his. The pressure was suffocating. Ibrahim Traoré hadn't slept in 2 nights. The letter from Biden lay open on his desk, surrounded by half-filled notebooks, torn-up drafts, and the fading smell of strong black coffee. His country waited. The world watched. And still, he hesitated. Every sentence he wrote felt like it carried the weight of a continent. He knew what was expected of him. A gracious reply. Diplomatic. Respectful. Thankful. But he also knew what his people expected: strength. Dignity. Pride. "I don't want to sound submissive," he told Yakuba Dio, his chief advisor, "but I also can't afford to seem ungrateful. The world reads weakness in politeness." Yakuba gave a tight nod. "Then write it for both. Speak with humility, but never from your knees." That evening, Traoré pulled out a clean sheet of paper and began again. This time, he wrote, not with caution, but with clarity. He stripped away the ceremonial tone, the scripted gratitude. Instead, he wrote from the core of who he was, a son of Burkina Faso, a product of revolution, a leader forged in fire, not formality. He began by acknowledging the gesture. President Biden. He wrote, "Your words reached me not as commands, but as a conversation, and for that, I thank you." But from there, the tone shifted. He described the daily realities of his people, not statistics, but stories. He wrote of a mother in Kaya who walks 10 kilometers each day for clean water, of school children learning under broken roofs, of young soldiers who fight not for money, but because no one else will. And then came the sentence that would later ripple through history: Africa is not waiting for rescue. We are waiting to be heard. He continued, if there is to be cooperation, let it be as equals, not in words, but in truth, in action. He did not lash out. He did not plead. What he offered was balance, a delicate, brilliant tension between gratitude and defiance. He closed with a message that spoke beyond borders. Let this be a beginning, not of favors, but of respect. When he was finished, he didn't speak. He simply slid the letter across the table to Yakuba, who read it in silence. At the final line, Yakuba looked up. It's bold, he said. It's honest, Traoré replied. That's more dangerous. The letter was sealed the next morning. No fanfare, no announcement, but someone leaked its delivery. By noon, media outlets across Europe and the U.S. had caught wind Traoré's spawns. The speculation began again, wilder, louder, more intense. Everyone wanted to know. Had he bowed? Had he barked back? Inside the palace, Traoré watched the chaos unfold with unsettling calm. It doesn't matter what they say, he told Yakuba. It matters what I said. And what he said, those 400 words penned late at night under a flickering lamp, would become the voice of a generation. A young president, a handwritten letter, and a message the world hadn't heard in decades. Africa was no longer whispering. It was speaking. Joe Biden unfolded the letter slowly. No cameras. No aides. Just him. The soft hum of morning light. And an envelope that felt heavier than it looked. He read the first line once, then again. By the third sentence, he had stopped breathing. There was no flattery, no political dance, just truth, unfiltered, and composed with a grace that cut sharper than confrontation. Traoré's words carried fire. Not of anger, but of conviction. You wrote to me with respect. It began. So I will answer with honesty. Biden kept reading. Paragraph after paragraph. The young president laid bare the complexities of African struggle, not as a plea, but as a mirror. He wrote of courage without resources, of dignity without attention, of generations forced to prove their humanity to a world that rarely looked twice. And then came the line that stopped Biden cold. We are not waiting to be saved. We are rising to be seen. He set the letter down. Outside, the wind rustled through trees. But inside, the stillness was deafening. Anne. Biden called, his voice low. Ann Carter arrived minutes later. He handed her the paper without a word. As she read, her eyes filled with something Biden hadn't seen in her for years. Wonder. He didn't just respond. She said softly. He elevated the entire conversation. By nightfall, the letter had been leaked. No one knew how. But suddenly, every major outlet from the New York Times to Al Jazeera had the full text. News anchors read excerpts live. Talk shows hosted late-night debates. Hashtags exploded. Number. Traoré speaks. Number. Letter to the world. Number. Equal not silent. In Burkina Faso, celebrations broke out in universities and cafes. Young people flooded the streets with chants, not of protest, but of pride. He said what we've all felt for decades. A student shouted, and he said it with class. But not everyone applauded. In the U.S., conservative pundits criticized Biden for opening a door he couldn't control. He empowered a narrative we weren't prepared to hear. One analyst warned. Others accused Traoré of posturing, of turning diplomacy into performance. Inside Traoré's office, the noise from abroad filtered through thick walls. Yakuba Dio entered with a printout of an American editorial titled "The Letter That Shamed the West." They're calling it a diplomatic masterpiece. Yakuba said, and a warning shot. Traoré didn't smile. This was never about shame. He replied, it's about being heard without shouting. Still, he felt the shift. His inbox overflowed with messages from leaders, journalists, educators. Some offered partnerships. Some demanded clarifications. A few sent congratulations, cloaked in careful language. And in all the noise, one thing became clear. The letter had done something. No summit, no sanction, no handshake had ever achieved. It had equalized the table, if only for a moment. Biden, sitting on his porch, stared at the dusk and whispered, that young man. He reminded me what leadership looks like when ego isn't invited to the room. Anne nodded. He didn't ask for permission. He claimed his voice. That night, across both continents, two very different leaders sat alone, one in a White House, one in a humble compound, each changed in ways they hadn't expected. Not by power, not by policy, but by words and the world. It wasn't just listening anymore. It was finally hearing. Months had passed. The headlines had faded. But the echo of that exchange, two letters, two leaders still pulsed beneath the surface of the world's political conversation. In Washington, Joe Biden returned to his quiet routines. But something in him had shifted. Every time he stood at a podium, every time he spoke about foreign policy or global unity, Traoré's words played in his mind like a bell that refused to stop ringing. We are not waiting to be saved. We are rising to be seen. He quoted it once in a televised speech. Then again, at a university commencement. By the third time, the crowd stood in applause. Ann Carter noticed the change. You're not speaking like a former president anymore, she said. You're speaking like a man who's still learning. And Biden didn't deny it. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré was navigating storms of his own. Inflation, infrastructure, dissent. None of the challenges had vanished just because the world noticed his letter. But something had changed. The way his people looked at him. He wasn't just a leader now. He was a symbol, a voice they believed could carry beyond borders. One afternoon, while visiting a rural school rebuilt with community donations, a little girl handed him a drawing. It showed two stick figures shaking hands, one with white hair, one wearing military fatigues. They're writing letters, she said. He smiled. That night, he kept the drawing beside his desk. Across the ocean, a new kind of dialogue had begun quietly. Unofficially, educators in New York reached out to schools in Ouagadougou. Cultural exchange programs were proposed. American students began reading about modern Africa, not in history chapters but in current events. Yakuba Dio watched it all unfold with cautious optimism. Words don't build roads, he reminded the president. But sometimes, they open the path. International analysts called it the letter effect. Think tanks studied it. Diplomats cited it. Young leaders from other developing nations pointed to Traoré's response as proof that dignity doesn't require power, only courage. Still, not everyone agreed. Skeptics insisted the moment was fleeting, that no treaty had been signed, no money exchanged hands, no policy changed. But those who understood diplomacy at its core knew better. The true legacy wasn't in laws or deals. It was in the shift of perspective. And the message was simple. Respect doesn't require a title. It requires listening. As months rolled into a year, both leaders knew their direct contact had ended. There would be no follow-up summit. No photo ops. Just that one extraordinary exchange, preserved in print and in the minds of millions. Before retiring for the night one evening, Biden sat down with a blank note card. He didn't write a new letter. He simply wrote one sentence and tucked it into his journal. Sometimes, the smallest voice changes the biggest rooms. And halfway across the world, Traoré stood before a crowded youth forum, holding a copy of the letter in his hand. This is not history, he said to thunderous applause. This is a beginning. Because in the end, it wasn't about power. It was about presence. It wasn't about being loud. It was about being heard. And it wasn't just about two men. It was about all of us. A reminder that words, when spoken with truth, can bridge oceans. And in a divided world, that may be the most powerful act of all.